thank you very much for your comments. I think we heard a position just now that is quite different from the one that was expressed in the presentation, and I think we should give you the opportunity perhaps to respond, and then we will open it up to the audience, unless you prefer that we invite the audience.
Well, I'll just say a couple of things.
Yep, I think we could.
Shall I use this, or can I
just? Yes, or you can speak.
If I'm, yes. So, well, the last point you made, I mean, I agree with that. Elsewhere, I've written on this topic, and I think particularly in sort of international negotiations, for example, often finding a shallow compromise is something which helps build confidence towards making a deep compromise. So in that sense, I'm not, I wouldn't say that shallow compromises necessarily rule out deep compromises. I think they can be the road towards one, because it's precisely when you find something that you can just do a trade on that parties often find that they can then agree on something which is more contentious and where only principled compromise will work. My claim is rather that you simply, you won't get very far through shallow compromises alone. But I think we probably agree on that. On whether democracy is, well, it's better not to have a moral view of the democratic ethos, but simply a procedural view of the democratic ethos. I mean, I used to think that myself, actually, to a degree, but I just don't think it works, partly because different principled views of democracy and of the nature of that process are often one of the things that's at issue between the parties involved. So it's not that they simply sort of can accept the procedures as such and sort of say, oh, I'm just accepting the procedures. They have some moral view towards those procedures. That's the reasoning that they have as to why those procedures are important in the first place. And so, to a degree, one of the reasons why compromise ultimately has to be deep is precisely because they'll need, one of the things they end up having to compromise on are the very nature of the procedures that they're engaged in and the attitudes that they hold towards each other. And that's why, although I use that distinction of Rawls's between modus vivendi and overlapping consensus, actually, as I said, and perhaps I ought to have written on the slide, it's more like overlapping compromise in my view, but it's of its nature is a deeper compromise. And so again, I think, and this I think was to some extent your first point. I think that politicians need to say more about why they think democracy is important in the first place, because that in itself is a way of getting people to move towards understanding compromise in deeper terms. I think it's perhaps precisely because people have a rather simple, shallow view of democracy as a process that they find the very notion of democracy as yielding compromises, simply in the very way in which parties form majorities on the whole, as something which is slightly dirty, whereas in fact I wanted to say it's actually a moral thing. It's about revealing equality of concern and respect to voters, and respecting them above all as reasoners. That's what leads us to compromise. So compromise, far from being a unfortunate necessity, is actually a part of the noble art of politics, if you like. So I think that's part of why I want to see it in these terms.
Can I have a question?
Please.
Well, then I think it becomes a question. I dropped that point I wanted to make about the voters as reasoners. Reflect them as reasoners. Well, how, in more concrete terms, how would you address them as reasoners? Because if I can tell you one thing, they don't reason with you all the time. So they have positions, and it's also hard for politicians to, go out there, have reasonings. Come, let us reason together. That doesn't happen very often. It certainly gives participation a place where such reasoning, such deliberative reasoning can take place. But it's not the normal case. And the question will be, how do you get to how do you communicate with your voters as reasoners if they don't have the space of reasoning? They often vote for you based on positions or deep-held convictions that are hard to, that are hard to apply to specific policy problems that you would like with them to reason about in order to, ground your compromise.
Well, I mean, I think, reasoning, of course, it sounds so abstract and intellectual that people are likely, to sort of say, oh, surely, people care about very concrete things. But people have reasons for caring about those very concrete things, and they normally are disposed to view the world in a certain moral light, I think. I don't think it's right to dismiss citizens as not having moral views about the world. I think they do. So one of the roles of politicians is to seek to articulate those more. I think they do to a degree. I think they do put forward a vision of the world. But maybe what they should be more honest about is that the particular policies that they may say they're going to try and achieve are there as sort of illustrations of the way in which they see the world, rather than commitments. In fact, on the whole, they don't, that hasn't been the style of politics until quite recently. But the view that has increasingly grown up, I've seen it in the UK and elsewhere, is, we need to get politicians much more focused on saying, this is what I'm going to do, precisely. And if they don't do it, then you really know that they're not going with you. And politicians themselves have they are parties to this. But actually, it's a crazy way to engage in policy, given that anyone knows that the world is a very unpredictable place.
Is that part of the democratic consensus, that the world is an unpredictable place?
Well, I think it's not something that I think that politicians themselves are to blame in making it seem that it isn't, and that the way in which they will convince people is by claiming that they will settle particular issues in a certain way, without not admitting that the world is a very unpredictable place. Whereas if they sort of said more, this is, as I think, it's still the way in which people often used to vote. I mean, so, you know, there used to be a strong commitment to voting left or right, because that was your ideological bent, okay? So increasingly, I think that what they ought to do is to express more the underlying vision behind.
Okay, that we agree upon. And that's why I wonder why representation as trusteeship, you know, which I think would be much closer to the idea you communicate your project, your intention, your involvement, you get a trust for that, and they trust it to, well, if you do compromise, you know, you do it as a trusted professional, so to speak.
Right.
Who cares about the details that most of the time voters aren't concerned with and can't be bothered with, because often compromise comes out not only of matters of you know, material matters, the problems that arise in the real world that get lost in, you know, election campaigning, but also because a certain compromise is shaped by a certain constellation in politics that is just, you know, temporal, that's just for that moment. So wouldn't that, you know, take a lot of pressure off Democrats if they could, you know, use trusteeship as the model?
Yeah, well, that's precisely why you can't allow them to do that, because then what they're sort of saying is, oh, well, look, I'm an expert, trust me. You know, you're essentially just voting for me as a kind of virtuous and knowledgeable person. I don't think that really works.
Well, we live in a modern and complex world. I mean, I think there's a argument to be made that's often not being made right now. The pirates challenge the notion that there need to be professional politicians, and I think to the detriment of democratic governance. And I'm saying democratic governance because I mean participation and inclusion, but on the other hand, I also mean governance in the sense of there's effective government, there's an output.
Yes.
And I think you do need professional politicians.
Let's widen the conversation a bit. See if there are questions or contributions from the audience, please. Please just introduce yourself and...
Okay, Niels Peterson, I'm teaching here at Hertie School and Law and Governance. And I have two questions. The first one, I wasn't always sure on which level you were arguing, whether on a normative or on a descriptive level, because normative, your conception seems to be very appealing, while sometimes I think this immoral view of democracy, for example, seems to be the claim can't be this is a good normative view, but this is a more accurate description of what politics is like. And so probably countering this with a normative argument, I'm not sure whether this works so much. So maybe you could make your point more clear there. And the second point is on your conception of reflective representation. I was wondering when you say that the role of a conservative politician, for example, is to represent conservative reasoning. Doesn't this presuppose that I make a deep decision for a party in my voting decision? So when I vote conservative, then it's because I'm conservative, but maybe it's for me it's just a shallow compromise. There's no really convincing party, right, and the conservatives are just the ones which are closest to me, but maybe I could vote for the Social Democrats or the Liberal Democrats next time. So it's not that I'm a deeply convinced conservative, but it's just one compromise of the party which is closest to me. Does your conception still work with such a conception of voting?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, I think it's both normative and descriptive. In other words, I think that one can reveal the immoral view to be simply incoherent, and it wouldn't work. It can't explain why people vote in the first place. So, I mean, when you look at why is voting going down, I think one of the reasons is that when you begin to appeal to people on the basis of vote for me because I'll implement X, that's a stupid reason to give somebody to vote, because the likelihood that their vote is going to actually lead to a particular policy coming about is, you know, they might as well stay at home. But that's not a good reason to appeal to self-interest on the basis of policies which will make you richer or whatever. The reasons why people vote, it's not simply a logical thing, there's also empirical work, is the expressive voter view, that you go to the polls in order to express a certain opinion of the world. And so that's why I think parties are successful, to the degree that they are able to capture a view of the world that voters find attractive. It's not by offering potentially successful policy packages, it's by offering attractive views of the world, which one hopes will be successful. But above all, the attraction is that this is a view of the world that I can sign up to. But then you'll sort of say, well, is that really happening because parties are full of churches or whatever, and I might just be going with the party which just seems to be nearest to me. But that is still nearest to my vision of the world, I would say. In other words, conservatism is a broad church, and within the Conservative Party there's quite a wide range of conservatisms. That's particularly the case in the UK, because our system encourages parties which are have a broader view. In countries where the electoral system allows smaller parties to exist, of course, those parties will tend to be more focused and concentrated, but still with a view to potential coalition partners, so that you get the spectrum that way. So I think that one of the things that parties do in that respect is build coalitions through their electoral program. But again, what makes it a successful electoral program is that it's able to capture a deep compromise between various visions of the world within a certain part of the ideological spectrum, or whatever. So that's what parties should be appealing to do, in my view.
Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to inject my two empirical problems. The one is, the problem of communication. Maybe I should rephrase that and say it's a problem of getting attention or mobilizing voters by, proposing certain positions that are so concrete that voters can relate to. So that's just the dominant way that it's being done, and the dominant logic of parliamentary party politics is that they compete for voter attention, voter mobilization, and votes, and so they'll do anything, to go there. So why should they, go back from positions and communicate, a worldview? I like that. I'm in a political planning unit. That's where we talk about how it all relates to one another. I wish that we could communicate that better, but it's hard to do. So I think that's the empirical problem number one. The second empirical problem is, how do you get to that democratic ethos, that compromise, the overlapping consensus, when competition is built into the genes of politics? Or what are the sources of that democratic ethos?
But, trying to mobilise voters around shallow compromises clearly isn't working. It isn't, because voter turnout is going down, and there's a clear logic as to why that's the case.
Yeah, so then you...
but this is one of the things, practitioners often sort of say, oh, academics, they really don't understand what's going on. But, one of the things that academics do is they look at trends that are occurring over long periods, and they extrapolate from them, and they sort of say, look, can't you see that this is happening? So, of course, you've convinced yourselves, because you talk every day and you sort of think, this is what we've got to do. But to change a practice, you often need people who come from the outside and sort of say, it really isn't working. And I think that you look at the trend, and it's demonstrably the case that this is a complete turn-off for voters. And rationally so. I mean, you know, voters are not irrational. They're very rational, I think. And if you're appealing to something which gives them no genuine incentive to vote for you, then they'll act rationally and turn off, and that's what's happened, I think. The democratic ethos, I mean, is quite compatible with competition. I'm not saying that you can't strive to win a majority. Absolutely. What I'm saying is that partly you win a majority in most systems by building compromise coalitions behind you in the first place. So it still applies in that. The argument I'm putting forward applies even so. No one wins an election by not compromising right from the very beginning, because they know that if you've got to win over 50% of the votes either with other coalition partners or on your own in a system like the UK, which could potentially allow that to happen, you've got to make loads of compromises to build a broad enough church to do that. But that's, you know, so it's not against competition. I think competition is vital to the democratic process, in fact. But one of the things that the competition provides the incentive to do is to compromise, because if you don't win that additional group of voters, they're going to fall to someone else. So it's precisely the competition for power which promotes compromise, I think.
I'm sure there are many questions. Yes, let's collect some.
Sandra Krüger, University of Exeter. I think, well, thank you for the presentation, first of all, and for the comment. I think it would be very interesting if you could possibly relate your argument about compromise and democratic representation to what's going on in Greece. I mean, quite obviously, there the case is a little bit more tricky than between the Conservatives and the Lib Dems in the UK. And so I'm just wondering, well, now we have the third party that has the mandate to build a coalition, and it's quite likely not to happen, and quite likely to see new elections sometime soon. So I'm just wondering, is it the party leaders that are not the Democrats, or is it the voters who haven't got it right? I mean, who is it, in your view, or how would you make sense of what's happening there?
Let's see who else would like to come in. But let me perhaps follow up on this and ask you to comment on whether your argument would be any different if you were to make it within the presidential system or within the parliamentary system. So of course I'm thinking about not only the elections in Greece, but the elections in France in terms of compromise and democracy and ethos.
Okay, yes, thank you. Well, I mean, I think the problem in Greece is the problem when you segregate or trim issues off the agenda. I mean, you know, so one of the things, I mean, if domestic elections aren't about national budgets, what else are they about? So if the decisions about national budgets have been taken off the agenda, then I think you're at the edge of not having a proper democracy in that sense. So I think that's in a way what has happened in Greece, is that, you know, the possibility for compromise of what historically have been the two main parties, the New Democrats and PASOK, had gone, because in a certain sense they'd had to take certain things off the agenda that the rest of the population, you know, well, certainly a lot of the population wants to have on the agenda. as something about which there could still be compromises. So I think that would be my reading in part of the situation there. I mean, I think my argument is one which applies much more to parliamentary than to presidential systems, in the sense that I favour. I think parliamentary systems are one of their great virtues is precisely in the fact that it produces or allows for that greater expression of the electoral, a more complex expression of the electoral will. Whereas, I mean, to a degree, of course, that happens in the presidential campaign. I mean, so Hollande had to win over the centrist vote in order to be able to defeat Sarkozy. So, I mean, that was quite critical to his winning. But I suppose whether that is necessarily then reflected in how he shapes his policies is less secure than it would be in a parliamentary system where, for example, a prime minister has to build their cabinet and their whole legislative programme over the distribution of votes that are in the parliaments, and so the link is clearer. It's more indirect in the presidential case. So yeah, I greatly favour parliamentarism over presidential systems.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. We're well over our limit already, but I think Klaus, would you like to come in? And then we give each of you the opportunity to have a
Okay, a very rich presentation. Thank you very much. I mean, a lot of things to think about. The dualism of procedure versus substance is something that is very suggestive. And I'm not sure that you can really make, as Mr. Gohl did, this dichotomy of procedure versus substance and rely on procedure. Because every democratic procedure has, as it were, and maybe you want to elaborate on this, the promise that majority rule, for instance, leads to something that qualifies by substantive criteria as fair. And also the procedure is justified by the fact that it leads to the peaceful conduct of conflict, right? That is something, so you cannot do without substance and rely on procedure by itself. That is one series of thoughts one could follow. But more important perhaps is every compromise needs a dimension or an axis on which you want. You choose the example of left versus right, but said at the beginning that it's not entirely clear what that means these days. And but you can also try to do a compromise along the now versus later dimension, or the local versus global dimension, and many others. So you need before you enter into a compromise, you need a second order agreement on the appropriate dimension, and I'm not sure how you do that. I mean, okay, another series of questions. But what I really want to turn to, that's perhaps a bit unfair, to highlight two concepts that were missing if I did not miss something, missing from your discussion. One is the concept of power. Power is the ability to impose the parameters of choice, you know, the range of choice. The Greek example, you said, well, the agenda is too narrow, and someone narrowed the agenda, and that is probably a phenomenon of social power. But I did not hear a very clear statement how you could integrate this. And another thing is the concept of deliberation that you came close to, but at the end, but did not really introduce in a systematic way. So is deliberation perhaps a version of finding compromise? You know, discovering in a exchange with others what it is that you really want, preference laundering type of learning. So is there any place for you for this concept, for these two concepts, power and deliberation, in your analysis of democratic practices?
Thank you.
Yes, well, power I did mention in the sense that I said that shallow compromises don't necessarily have to be substantively fair. They simply mirror the power, the distribution of the bargaining power of the respective parties. So one of the advantages, I should have stressed it more, I think, of deeper compromise is that I think that when you're forced to compromise in a principled way because you're putting together the different principled views, then it becomes much harder to simply force a compromise on the basis of superior bargaining power. I mean, that's my claim anyway, because in a certain sense, it involves a more inherent respectfulness of the arguments that you're having to deal with in order to put them together. So it is more difficult, I think, to simply impose a view. One could sort of say that of course, does so because you're then engaged in the process of deliberation. I mean, I tend to steer a little bit clear of using the term deliberation because it's become a very weighted term, which is particularly identified with you know, a Habermasian view and the development of politics orientated towards consensus. I mean, so not in this particular paper, but elsewhere where I've written about compromise, I've done it very much in contradistinction to that Habermasian notion of consensus, and to argue that actually compromise is not simply a feature of bargaining, but also of arguing, if you like. But so, and that it makes more sense to see deliberation in these sorts of compromising terms than as perhaps orientated towards consensus, given the nature of pluralism. I mean, so I don't use the term because I don't, you know, maybe I should have done, but simply in order not to be associated with a certain kind of understanding of what deliberation involves. Whereas the argument I'm putting forward is that deliberation is more orientated towards compromise. I mean, just on the dimension point, which I think is a very interesting one. I mean, I can't go into it here, but one rather interesting technical issue is that if you imagine a series of votes, if you on specific issues taking place, then actually one result of a vote by vote on a program, as opposed to just voting, is that the tendency of that is to produce a Condorcet winner. So you get a kind of collective compromise through just taking issues by issues. You'd still have the difficulty of deciding, is this issue, can we isolate for each issue that we do what the dominant dimension is, local, global, left, right, whatever. But if one could, then one could just take them serially, and serially would produce the same sort of result.
Thank you. With your permission, let's leave it here. I'm sure we can continue this interesting discussion over refreshments, which are just outside the door. Let me thank you for coming tonight, for participating in the discussion. Let me thank our presenter for coming all the way from London today, and let me thank you for coming all the way up across town today. And I thought it was very, very, very good. It was a good presentation, a good discussion, and I certainly learned a lot, and I hope you did too. Thanks.